Hello, hello, and welcome to the September installment of my Reading Like Rory video series. In summary, this month I read 8 books on the Rory Gilmore list plus one bonus novel, and that brings my running total for the Rory Reading Challenge to 23. So we are inching our way down that list of 400 plus titles, but I guess every book counts, so we're on our way. This month was actually kind of an interesting combination of different genres. I read a kid's book, I read a couple nonfiction kind of philosophy books, I read a memoir, a few novels, so there'll be something in this video for everyone. And without further ado, I guess we should dive in. The first book that I read this month was Atonement by Ian McEwan. I have to slow down when I said that because I've tried to say that phrase a couple times. I don't know if it's all the like N's and M's in there that my tongue kept like getting twisted over, but I got it out this time. So Ian McEwan wrote this book. I believe this came out in the early 2000s, and it came out after he won the Booker Prize for his novel Amsterdam. And I think Atonement was also shortlisted for the Booker, but didn't receive the Booker Prize. And then, of course, it was made into a movie starring Keira Knightley and James McAvoy, which I believe won an Oscar. So a lot of you are probably pretty familiar with this book already, or familiar with the plot. For those of you who aren't, to summarize, the young girl who is the narrator and one of the main characters of the novel is a very precocious, artistic girl. She's a writer and writes a play at the beginning of the novel for her cousins are coming to visit, and her brother is coming home from where he lives in the city. So it's kind of a special occasion for her. And while she's trying to get the play ready and get her cousins to rehearse the play and things like that, she witnesses a couple interactions between her sister and her sister's love interest, who's James McAvoy's character in the movie. And this young girl misunderstands what she sees. And yeah, I don't want to get too much away, so we'll put it at that. But as the title implies, one of the main themes and really character arcs in the story is this girl and then woman living with the mistakes that she made as a child and trying to atone for them, both within herself, kind of trying to forgive herself for her childish actions, and which were not made maliciously, but were made out of ignorance, and then also trying to kind of earn forgiveness or atone for her actions with her sister and her sister's partner, who were the primary victims, I would say, of her childish ignorance. So that's a very vague version of the plot. Ian McEwan's writing style is really cinematic, and it does not surprise me that someone read this book and thought we should turn this into a movie. I think, in fact, Ian McEwan was a screenwriter as well. I'm not sure if he wrote the screenplay for the Atonement movie, but he has a really cinematic writing style, which enables him to build not only that frame story, but also within the main section of the narrative, he kind of floats around with individual chapters, different points of view of the three main characters. And in doing so, he emphasizes and kind of plays out, I would say, the major interest of the book, which is the concept of authorship and the role of the artist, and what power an artist or an author has, and what their obligations are to the truth and to their audience, and how that might change over time or change across genre. I think that's something that the author is very interested in exploring with this story. So my takeaway for writers is a recommendation or maybe a writing prompt to kind of play with the idea of writing yourself into your fiction. And I don't mean that in the sense of making yourself a character. You know, people often joke that like every writer's protagonist is some iteration of themselves. So that's not really what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is more using fiction to explore what it feels like to write fiction, or what it means to write fiction, or maybe what it means to read it, and kind of playing with the layers that are inherent in any kind of physical art, the layers of meaning that are inherent in any kind of physical art. Maybe I shouldn't say physical, maybe I should say any kind of art. So that is my prompt for writers inspired by Atonement. All right, so the next two books on the list I'm actually going to discuss as a pair. That is The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Figure out where the camera is. The Art of War by Sun Tzu, and then The Art of Living by Epictetus. Epictetus. Oh my gosh. Epictetus. We'll just call him Big E. The similarity for in both of these is that they were both teachers, and they both write in a really straightforward manner that is obviously intended to impart wisdom. And both of them use repetition. Both of them almost state the obvious in a lot of places, because they, like a good teacher does, kind of reinforcing the things that are important to remember, or sort of what they see as like foundational truths that their other lessons are built upon. So there is a little bit of similarity in that sense. And, you know, I think that those are definitely techniques that writers can use. Like I said, since these aren't, I don't want to say they're not creative, or that they're not art, but their main goal was to teach, impart wisdom, impart what they saw as truths. So it's just a little bit different in terms of taking away creative inspiration for your own work. I would say probably more likely that authors will be inspired by the messages in these books as opposed to the style. Not that the style's bad, just that it's that kind of very straightforward, pared down approach, which we will discuss in fiction later in the video. But for now, just a quick summary. So I think I mentioned Epictetus was one of the early Stoic philosophers. So the book is kind of like, well, this is an example of two really short ones, but I think it's like 97 little like lessons, like this. So yeah, like I said, it's very like teachery, and it's fun. I bought this one used, and someone else had already given me some marginalia, so it's kind of funny to see what they say. But yeah, I marked a couple passages that I liked, so I guess I can give you an example of, you know, of the writing style and the types of lessons. So for example, this lesson is called Care for What You Happen to Have. And I won't read the whole section, but, you know, the closing line is, the important thing is to take great care with what you have while the world lets you have it, just as a traveler takes care of a room at an inn. So, you know, kind of the core of Stoic philosophy is to truly understand and embrace the fact that as people, we are rational creatures, and that we are capable of receiving impressions from the physical world through our senses. And what sets us apart from non-rational creatures like animals is that we can then process those impressions and choose how we react to them and choose how we feel about them. So that kind of pairing of rationality and choice, I would say, is the core of Stoicism. So, you know, kind of another way to phrase it is like understanding what we're in control of and controlling it. So I would say I enjoyed reading this. It's not one that I'm going to, you know, be probably returning to frequently. And the same with The Art of War, because in a very literal sense, I'm lucky to not be a general needing to prepare to lead anyone into battle. But of course, the reason that this has become such a classic is because although it is written as a guidebook for people making war, and there are some like really literal passages about like what to do if you need to cross swampy ground when the enemy is at your back or whatever, you know, like kind of like literal advice about terrain and stuff. A lot of it is about conflict and decision making at the end of the day. Okay. And, you know, so it's kind of core premise actually is that war, or I think we can extrapolate to say like costly conflict, should be avoided, and that diplomacy, you know, I think he says many times something along the lines of like the best battle is the one not fought. So, you know, diplomacy is kind of the winning strategy, but obviously has a lot of advice for when battles are inevitable. And he really emphasizes strategy, like knowing yourself, knowing your strengths, knowing your weaknesses, and then also knowing your enemy and the landscape to that level of detail. So I knew there was that strategic emphasis in the book. I had, you know, heard that and probably been assigned passages in school here and there. But what I was surprised by was how much he emphasized like subterfuge and spycraft, kind of building on that idea that like, you know, strategy and intelligence are the way to win a battle. And he was like, wars are won by spycraft, basically. And like, you gotta get in there and know everything about your enemy and know why they're going to make the decisions that they're going to make before they make them. And so I thought that was kind of interesting and fun to read. And I think if you were writing like battles, or, you know, the series that came to my mind was The Wheel of Time, but because there's a big chunk of that book is like, of that series, I should say, is lots of time where armies are kind of like moving across the continent and like positioning themselves in relationship to each other and like having little skirmishes here and there and things like that. So I think Sun Tzu could be very informative in terms of writing that kind of content. So there you go. That's the art of miniseries. Moving on, the next book that I read, I actually listened to, was Babe, also titled The Sheep Pig. I believe Babe might have been the American title, and the original British title was The Sheep Pig, hyphenated like sheepdog, because of course Babe learns to herd sheep as if he were a dog, even though he's a pig. This was a quick listen. I think I listened to it in one morning while I was out on my run. It's definitely a kid's book. I'd say it's written for like first, second grade, and that's probably about the maturity level in terms of the content. There are some things that are a little bit darker in there that might be a little harder for younger kids, but yeah, it was fun. It's almost fable-like, and that is what I enjoyed in terms of kind of thinking about it as a writer, even a writer who's not writing stories for kids, with the talking animals, and also with I feel like the message was very straightforward and accessible in the way that fables often are, where it felt like it had been written to give a message. And yeah, it was very charming in that sense. And I think that the form or the genre of fable is one that can be really fun to play around with. I've definitely read a lot of wonderful books that take the concept of a fable or a fairy tale and then complicate it by making the characters real seeming adults with conflicting emotions and needs and yada yada. So you know, it's kind of fun to go back and read one that's not that and is kind of the sort of straightforward, almost morality tale for kids. And this is a very sweet instance of that. I think that another fun inspiration that writers can take from Babe is the way the author uses one fantastical element in an otherwise very real world. So a lot of times that's referred to as magical realism. Again, because of the childlike, fable-like quality to this book, I don't know that I would call this magical realism, but that description definitely extends to magical realism as well. So in this case, of course, the element of fantasy is that the animals can talk to each other in using human-like language. But everything else about the story is very realistic. I would encourage even authors who aren't writing fantasy and who aren't interested in that, to think about one element in their stories that they can make fantastical. And that might just be exaggerating it a little bit because its role is very important in the novel. And I have maybe an example of that I can refer you to later in the video when I talk about my bonus read. Yeah, that's my inspiration or prompt from Babe. All right, the next book, where is she? The next book that I read this month was The Awakening by Kate Chopin, which I got from Half Price Books for $1.99, so see here. I was especially excited about this one because I read this in high school, and my best friend and I loved this book. We had a really incredible literature class, and it was like world literature. And we read incredible books from all around the world. And we read a lot of guys that were about this long, which I think probably helped our liking it. But I just remember we were both really moved by this book, and there are a couple images in this book that lasted with me. So I was very excited to read it again, and I was excited to find this exact edition at Half Price Books because this is the exact edition that I had in high school. This Dover thrift one, which I'm not crazy about the cover, but I'm wondering, I can't figure out where the camera is. I'm wondering if that is a reproduction of the original cover or something, because this was published in 1899 is when it first came out. And doesn't that give you vibes of that era? I mean, it's supposed to, of course, but I don't know. Anyway, I'm just supposing here. But yeah, this I'll read the first line of the back of the book because it'll give a summary so I don't have to. When first published in 1899, The Awakening shocked readers with its honest treatment of female marital infidelity. Audiences accustomed to the pieties of late Victorian romantic fiction were taken aback by Chopin's daring portrayal of a woman trapped in a stifling marriage, who seeks and finds passionate physical love outside the straitened confines of her domestic situation. So there's the there's The Awakening in a nutshell. It's beautiful. If you haven't read it, nice and short read, very powerful, and definitely worth the few hours that'll take you to get through this one. In terms of takeaways for writers, I would say that The Awakening is a very textbook example of the literary style of naturalism, which I think by 1899, that's what I said, right? 1899, yeah. 1899 would have been close to the tail end of naturalism as a literary movement. It was new and kind of groundbreaking, maybe in the more in the Victorian years, so the 1860s and 70s, I would say. So by then it would have been a very well established style in literary circles, and maybe that's why this is a very mature kind of classic example of that style. Anyway, naturalism, as the name implies, is a form of realism, kind of uses very realistic descriptions of life and the details of life to describe often social conditions, but also environmental conditions as well. And kind of the thematic or philosophical underpinning of naturalism is the idea that human experience and people's characters are shaped by those real forces around them. So we're kind of creatures of our environment, we're creatures of our society, and In the case of Edna, the protagonist in The Awakening, her actions, her options, her worldview are all shaped by the fact that she's a married woman and has kids, and there are certain kind of expectations, there are certain freedoms that are allowed to her, certain freedoms that aren't, and that really shapes her whole world in a way that it's impossible to shake. And similarly for the environment, this is set in New Orleans and surrounding area. They are like a oceanside resort for a lot of it, and then back in the city of New Orleans. And one of the things that really stuck with me, like I said, were the images and the physical descriptions of the ocean, which is very important in the novel, almost a character in a way. And the heat, and then also I love the descriptions of the New Orleans city streets and the houses, and but yeah, as a naturalist novel, you get pretty rich descriptions of like the chandelier in the house and the glasses on the table and the way the night ocean air feels on your skin and all that kind of stuff, which may surprise you because it's so small. And that gets me to the kind of style inspiration or takeaway for writers is in the midst of those really lush descriptions, Chopin uses very simple prose. And I think the result of that is that those moments of very vivid description, which have, as I mentioned, powerful implications for the character's internal being, her internality, herself as a person. And it kind of, the simple prose lets those moments of lushness and vibrancy sing. So I feel like it's an example of where less is more when the prose is just kind of, but when the prose is moving the plot along and, describing the connective tissue prose is pared down so that the important moments and the things that you really want to sing have the space and the room to sing. And more importantly, I think the reader's mind has room to appreciate them. So it's kind of like less is more so that more can be more when more happens. So I think, just that concept of the contrast between simple prose and lush descriptions, and also the concept of leaving space for the images or the descriptions that are really important, leaving space for those to shine. And I think that's a takeaway that any writer can use and should keep at top of mind no matter what kind of style they're writing in. Obviously, you don't have to be writing this style of novel to take that lesson. I think it's on, I edit a lot of nonfiction books, and it's true there as well. You don't want the book to feel too crowded. You don't want a reader's head to feel crowded when they're reading. Okay, we'll move on. So the next book on the list, what do I want to discuss next? I guess I'll discuss Bel Canto next. The reason I'm hesitating is because we're getting into my personal favorite, most exciting books for the month. So we are entering a streak of 3 5-star books, which I hesitated to say because I don't want to dilute what 5-star means for me. So I actually thought kind of long and hard about this, like maybe 4.5, like I don't know, do I want to say 5-star? But to me, I guess, and I know some people get like, I'm not really all that into the star rating thing. I don't really track my 5 stars anywhere, but I wanted to for this Rory Gilmore, just as another aspect of my reading experience as I'm going through this list. But anyway, for me, 5-star means among the best books I've ever read, and 5-star means I would recommend it to anyone, and 5-star means I would happily read it again, I think. So, and the first of these, and actually 2 of these, are by the same author. which is another reason why I was like, well, I don't want to give her too much, but she's quickly developing into one of my favorite authors, who is Ann Patchett. So, as I mentioned, the next book on the list is Bel Canto. That was quite a wind-up, by Ann Patchett. So this is Ann Patchett's fourth novel, and it won a PEN/Faulkner Award. It was published in the early 2000s. And this novel is fiction, but it was based on a true event, one that I had never heard of, in the 90s, called the Lima Crisis, or I guess that's what the media dubbed it, when a group of terrorists took over the Japanese embassy and held people hostage in the embassy for well, I don't know how long the actual crisis was. In the novel, it's like several months, so I think that's probably is similar. I didn't read too much about the IRL Lima crisis, but yes, the Japanese embassy, people in the Japanese embassy were held hostage by terrorists in Lima, Peru in 1996, I think into 1997. So, Ann Patchett was inspired to write a novel based on that news story. As the title implies, Bel Canto, or Bel Canto, I suppose, music and opera are primary kind of themes and also plot devices in the novel. So the kind of general setup for the novel, this one, in the novel, it's not at an embassy where everyone's held hostage. It's at the home of the vice president she doesn't name it Peru. She calls it an unnamed country, I think, so she could take some liberties with the history and the cultures and stuff. But so the vice president, and they're having a party at the house for a very wealthy Japanese business executive, a birthday party for him. And he, because the country's government is kind of courting this Japanese major corporation to like do business in their country and do manufacturing in their country, whatever. And how they incentivize, excuse me, I need a drink. How they incentivize this executive to come is they throw him a birthday party and they invite as a performer the most famous opera soprano in the world, and she's going to come and sing some songs. And this Japanese business executive is like a huge opera fan. So it's a bunch of people who don't really know each other in this house, and a lot of people who don't speak the same language. There are the government officials from the host country who speak Spanish. Then there's this Japanese executive and his kind of compatriots, whoever traveled with him from his company, who speak Japanese. And then there are other international, there's like some there's the ambassador from France is there. There are some Russian, either business people or diplomats from all over the world. And the soprano, the opera singer, is American. So this is important because once terrorists invade the house during the party, and they're all held hostage, but a lot of them can't communicate with each other. So language is also a major force in the novel, and kind of more importantly than that, like how people develop relationships without language, especially through music, but also in other ways. So the other main character in the novel is the translator who came with the business executive, and he is a fucking amazing translator. He speaks like every language, and he's this sweet, brilliant, very talented translator. So he kind of becomes the core person here. Like the people who are holding everyone hostage start to rely on him because they can't talk to everyone, and he ends up kind of being almost like an executive assistant for them in some ways, like writing stuff down and like making copies and like communicating with there's like a Red Cross negotiator guy. So he becomes very like central to the story. So that's the plot. I gave this 5 stars because it's just one of those novels that is not only beautifully written, so it's just a pleasure, the language is very pleasurable, but it was also just a really moving story about human connection, and there's some romance, and it's just ironic, I guess, because the inciting incident in the plot is people, violently taking over a home and holding people hostage out of, desperation, really. So it's not a peaceful background, but the story, in my mind, is really a celebration of the inherent goodness of people and how connections can be forged in the hardest times. And almost in my personal life experience, it almost seems like our greatest connections are forged in times of stress and difficulty, and when we kind of need to lean on each other in extraordinary circumstances, and that's definitely the case here for the characters in this book. So highly recommend. Ann Patchett is really a master. And as I was reading a little bit about the book, I'm trying to find the quote again because it made me so happy. So I can't remember if I mentioned this already, but the narration does kind of, the narration is third person omniscient. So we have insight into the thoughts of many, if not all, of the characters. Yeah, we get inside most of the characters' heads. And of course, because they're all being held hostage in this house, they're all often like sitting in the same room. So you get, the unique perspective of kind of like watching them all in the same room and hearing their different thoughts. So a true omniscient narrator. And I was delighted because Ann Patchett described it as wanting to write a book where the narrator moves from person to person within a room, and she called it the Anna Karenina third perspective. And that made me very happy because we just read Anna Karenina on our on our big reading journey. And I think I mentioned it when I was discussing Anna Karenina as well, but that was also a situation where like you would see a scene from one character's perspective, and then you would get the exact same scene from another character's perspective, which is a really fascinating way to explore how our own perceptions and memories and past experiences color how we experience the same, objectively the same events. And yeah, that's a connection that I likely wouldn't have made without the Rory Gilmore reading list to get me there. So there we go. Bel Canto with its Anna Karenina-esque third person omniscient narration, 5 stars. Okay, the final 2 books on the Rory list for this month were Autobiography of a Face by Lucy Grealy. And then while I was reading this, I discovered that it has connections to another Ann Patchett book, Truth and Beauty. So this is the one that caused a little delay in my recording this video because I just finished this book like last week. And then I was like, oh, I gotta read this one before I make the video. So these are both nonfiction, and definitely 5 stars. Would I give them 5 stars individually? I think I would, but as a pair, definitely 5 stars. They go together. I would recommend these to anyone, and I would recommend they read both. If you are doing a book club, I think these would be fascinating to read as a book club. I want to start a book club so that I can read these 2 together with a group and talk about them with other people. So that's my recommendation there. Okay, we'll start with the first one, Autobiography of a Face by Lucy Grealy. So this book was not on my radar at all, and I'm having read it and having done some research about it, I'm very surprised and a little disappointed that it wasn't, and very grateful to have discovered it now. So as I mentioned, this is nonfiction. It's a memoir. I believe for this is so funny now that I'm thinking about this. I was gonna say I believe that Lucy Grealy in like interviews that I heard and stuff, she preferred the term autobiography. And as I started to say that, I was like, what is the difference between autobiography and memoir? Let's pause and look it up. Okay, I'm back. There are a lot of hot takes out there, but I will summarize. I think the general consensus is that memoirs may take more creative liberty when telling a true story of one's own life, whereas an autobiography is usually used to describe when someone hasn't taken as much creative liberty with the writing and maybe is less interested in expressing or discussing themes and more interested in expressing kind of chronological, factual events, even though both are true. Yes. So I'm going to stand by calling this one a memoir. So Lucy Grealy was a writer, obviously, but in undergrad and in her MFA at Iowa's Writers Workshop, she studied poetry and I think published various poems in magazines and collections and things like that. Her two books are this one, Autobiography of a Face, as well as a collection of essays titled As Seen on TV, which I have not read, but I am planning to after being introduced to her with this book. So, how to summarize? I might just read a little bit off the back of this book. And I'm reading, this is a quote from the book. I'm not reading the summary, but this little excerpt. I spent 5 years of my life being treated for cancer, but since then I've spent 15 years being treated for nothing other than looking different from everyone else. It was the pain from that, from feeling ugly, that I always viewed as the great tragedy of my life. The fact that I had cancer seemed minor in comparison. So the inciting event for Lucy's story is she had childhood cancer when she was, I believe, 10. She was diagnosed with Ewing's sarcoma. And that grabbed me right away because my husband actually had Ewing's sarcoma in his 20s. So, you know, immediately my heartstrings were personally very tugged when I read the description of this book. Lucy's tumor was, so sarcoma is a bone cancer, and her tumor was in her jaw. So they remove her jaw, a big part of her lower jaw, actually I think her whole lower jaw, when she's like 10. And then she has her first surgery. And then she has, like I said, a couple of years of chemo. The chemo is successful. She doesn't have a resurgence of cancer ever in her life. But as that passage alluded to, she then spends the rest of her life chasing a more normal looking face. So she has, by the end of her life, I think like 38 surgeries. Fascinating and scary and tragic. So, you know, that's her experience from a very young age. She is just this brilliant, very insightful person. And her memoir, you can tell that she trained as a poet because the way she describes things and the way her attention is drawn to things and her insightfulness into other people's behaviors and also into her own needs, and, you know, often self-destructive or problematic ways that she pursues her needs. It's just a really incredible story. So the autobiography of a face ends when she's, how old is she? I think, oh shoot, now I can't remember. But it, you know, this doesn't cover her whole life. We'll just put it that way. And then there's an afterword in here by Ann Patchett. So that is how I discovered that they were best friends. They met in college in undergraduate at Sarah Lawrence, and then they went to Iowa together. And after that, they remained best friends. after Lucy died, so you know that Lucy died as a reader of this book because it says it in her bio. She died in 2002. But like I said, this book stops 10, 15 years before she dies, so we don't know why. So I started searching. I was very interested in that, and also interested in her connection to Ann Patchett when I discovered that after she died, Ann Patchett wrote this memoir about her friendship with Lucy Grealy. So this kind of picks up where Autobiography of a Face ends and tells, and also overlaps some, but kind of tells Anne's perspective, her experience being Lucy's friend, trying to support Lucy, and receiving a lot of love and support from Lucy as well. So this book, and the subtitle is A Friendship, and that is very apt. This book is really about friendship, the friendship that they have, and how complicated and beautiful and problematic it is. And also you get more details about Lucy's later life. She dies of a drug overdose. She became addicted to pain medication and then to heroin at some point in her journey of these constant surgeries. And I believe her death was ruled an accidental overdose. She was dealing with addiction at that point and had experienced a couple close calls with overdoses previous to that. So it's a very tragic story. It's also just really beautiful. Lucy is a really, like I said, a very brilliant and very energetic, very unique person, and that comes through in her writing, and also comes through so beautifully in Ann Patchett's writing. This is like a real love song to her friend, but the kind of love song that doesn't look away from flaws and problems. So reading them back to back was really incredible, and I would highly recommend it. I'm gonna be really honest, I don't feel like I have enough emotional distance from those two books yet to kind of talk about them as much about how can we write like Ann Patchett and Lucy Grealy. So my takeaway and part of my fascination here, which I'll just pass along as my as my takeaway, is the concepts of literary friendships. But yeah, I'm very, very fascinated by friendships between writers, or friendships between artists in general, I guess I could say, because I think that, as I've mentioned before, I very much view writing as a communal activity and a team sport. And it's such a satisfying and fascinating discovery as a reader to realize these two authors were having beer together after they wrote all day or whatever, I just love the idea of that, and I love the crossovers and inspirations that happen. And Ann Patchett described that really, because they lived together when they were doing their MFAs in Iowa, and she would describe they would kind of take Lucy would have a line from a poem, and Ann Patchett would be like, oh, I want to write a story about that or whatever. I can't remember who it started with, but she had this example with The Magician's Assistant, which is another Ann Patchett novel, that Ann Patchett had an idea for a story or something, and wrote down the phrase "The Magician's Assistant," and then Lucy Grealy loved that and immediately took it and wrote a poem titled "The Magician's Assistant" something or other, and then Ann Patchett later came back and wrote her novel. So that's kind of a really on the nose example of it. But yeah, I just think that the idea of discovering what a writer's community was and having their relationships and kind of their social context informing the way that you read is really cool and fascinating. And it was a really, really exciting discovery for me to find that these two not only knew each other and went to school together, but were lifelong best friends, very intimate friends. Okay, and finally, so that's it for the Rory books for September. So I just have one left, and I'll stop yapping your ear off. This is the bonus book that I read this month. I wrote a study guide on this one. I'm kind of developing a niche with my study guide writing job. I feel like I've been pretty much locked in as one of their historical fiction summary writers. So this is a historical fiction novel set in World War II. I liked but didn't love this one. I have read a lot of World War II historical fiction, so I have a lot to compare it to. This was an enjoyable read for sure. It just didn't sing for me. One fun discovery, though, was I did learn about a British clandestine operation that I had not read about before, which was the SOE, Special Operations Executive, which is like a wartime department created by Churchill. It was not a spy department, but they were responsible for and engaged in sabotage, secretive sabotage. So I think their main efforts and the efforts that are depicted in this book were supporting French resistance fighters. So kind of like, guerrilla warfare, grassroots resistance efforts, and supporting them by getting them supplies, but also by helping with sabotage efforts. So the big one in this book is like they blow up a bridge that the Germans would need to get to Normandy, where the D-Day invasion was taking place. So that kind of thing. The main character, two of the main characters are involved with the SOE, specifically with a female radio operator unit. And then this novel does use the dual timeline trope, where there's a character later, closer to current, a later date. Oh, it was like an awkward way to describe it. There's dual timelines. One of them's happening a little bit later, and that later character is like, uncovering documents that point back to like a mystery with the earlier characters, and she's like researching them and trying to uncover their story as you're reading their story taking place. I feel like that's a pretty classic structure for historical fiction. The unique twist on that in this book is the character who's a little bit later is actually only like 3 years later. So it's just after the end of World War II that the later narration is happening. So she actually meets one of the other main characters. So yeah, I think if you enjoy historical fiction, and especially especially the setting of Vichy France and the efforts of the French resistance, and are more curious about how women were involved in war efforts, which is definitely an under-celebrated aspect of World War II, then I think this will be a fun one. But again, like I said, it didn't totally sing for me, but it wasn't a bust. And if you are interested in this, I think I mentioned when I was talking about Babe that I would maybe have an example of not a fable or not a magical realist book kind of highlighting or turning up the one element. And I would say that in this book she does that with the radio. I guess they call it radio. I should call it like a transceiver, because they're sending Morse code. It's not like voice stuff. So I don't want people to think it's like a walkie-talkie type thing. It's like a beep, 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 beep type little thing. But they have these, they're operating in secret in France, Nazi-occupied France. So they have these like very stealthy little units that they carry around in little suitcases. And the radio operators develop really like strong almost relationships with their radios, and they have different signatures of their typing, so that someone can tell, like a fingerprint almost, someone can like tell that it's you by your unique pattern of sending your Morse code and things like that, which it's all based in reality, but the way the author writes it and emphasizes it almost makes it feel magical or larger than life. which is effective because it's such a vital part of the story. So that's perhaps an example of how that technique could work for you, or you could play around with it even if you're not writing fantasy or stories with magical elements. Alrighty, I will sign off for September, and I will be back in your feed in another month to discuss my next batch of books and hopefully celebrate Halloween with you. All right, thanks for listening.